Dred Scott versus Sandford, the case that changed the United States forever. What is citizenship? You might picture a blue passport booklet, a 4th of July poster, or even a Pledge of Allegiance. But it's something much more. Not only is citizenship a source of pride for many, but it has vast implications for how someone can live their life. It can determine where you work, where you can travel, whether or not you can vote, and even if you'll be allowed to stay in the country with your family. But the very concept of citizenship, who should be a citizen of the United States, and how people should be allowed to become one, has been at the center of U.S. political debates for centuries. For African Americans in the 19th century, the question of whether they were, or could ever be, citizens of the United States was part of a decade-long court battle that centered on the circumstances of a man named Dred Scott. Though Scott's case, which ultimately ended up in the Supreme Court as Scott versus Sandford, was initially about whether one man would be able to live his life as free or enslaved, it became something much larger, centered in the very prospect and possibility of black citizenship. Historians estimate that Scott was born into slavery around the start of the 19th century in Southampton County, Virginia, to an enslaver of a man named Peter Blow. Scott was eventually purchased by an army surgeon named John Emerson, who moved Scott from the enslaved state of Missouri to the free state of Illinois, and then again to the free territory of Wisconsin. There, Scott met and married his wife, Harriet Robinson, and they started a family. By 1840, John Emerson's wife, Irene, returned to St. Louis along with Dred Scott and his family. In 1843, John died suddenly, and Scott and his family became the sole property of Irene. Dred Scott may have attempted to buy his family's freedom from Irene, but from what most historians can tell, she refused. 3 years after John had died, Dred Scott filed a suit for his freedom in a St. Louis district court. But before we look at Scott's case, we must understand the political importance of the slave states and the free states. At the beginning of 1840, the United States was composed of 24 states and 5 territories, a large jump up from the original 13 colonies. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the landmass of the country, which meant that there were new states to admit. 17 years later, Congress eventually solved this dispute between the North and the South states by creating the Missouri Compromise, which added the slave state of Missouri to the Union and the free state of Maine to the Union, keeping the balance between the states, but also banning slavery above the 3630 parallel in northern Missouri to keep the balance as well. But as the U.S. expanded, more individuals wanted to travel across state lines, and that created some unique legal issues. This is what Dred Scott versus Sandford was all about. In 1846, Dred Scott filed a suit for his freedom in a St. Louis district court. His claim was based on Missouri law and precedent that if an enslaved person was relocated to a free state or territory, they were then considered free, and thus they couldn't be re-enslaved upon entering a slave state again. And since John Emerson had taken Dred Scott to live in both Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory at various points, both of which were free domains, it seems like they had a pretty good case. After a bit of back and forth, Dred Scott eventually did win his family's freedom in 1850. But the case got appealed to the Missouri Supreme Court, which ruled against the lower court's decision, while noting, "Times now are not as they were when the former decisions on this subject were made." For reasons unknown, Dred Scott's previous owner, the Blow family, decided to financially support Scott's ventures into freeing his family in court. Dred Scott and his family were sent back into slavery, but Scott kept going. He received assistance from local abolitionists who helped him file suit in a federal court. By then, Irene had left Missouri and remarried, and for reasons historians have never quite figured out, the focus of the case went to her brother, John Sandford. Eventually, the case got to the U.S. Supreme Court, but once things got there, it did not go well. The moment this case arrived at the Supreme Court was an extremely bad time for such a large case dealing with such big issues to be brought to the Supreme Court, It was a time in which the issue of slavery hugely dominated the political debates in Washington as the country expanded. The core of Dred Scott's legal argument was that he had lived in free areas of the country with his enslaver, Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory. The federal government at this time did not have specific legislation addressing the issue, so the United States Supreme Court was left to sort things out. The U.S. Supreme Court and the rest of the country were dealing with big problems here. If an enslaved person is moved from a slave state to a free state, is that individual now free? What if you're riding on a carriage leaving a slave state and pass through a free state? Is that person free on the carriage while it's in the free state, but enslaved again when it passes back into a slave state? These are the type of big questions that the country was wrestling with at the time. Finally, in 1853, Dred Scott had officially filed suit in federal court against John Sandford. 4 years later, the Supreme Court came to their decision. The decision was seen as one of the worst rulings in Supreme Court history. The Supreme Court ultimately did not side with Scott and sided with the justices 7-2. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote in the majority opinion that Scott did not have the standing to sue because enslaved African Americans were not citizens of the United States. He also wrote that black people are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. And in outlining the rationale for his decision, he made the highly controversial statement that black people had no rights for which the white man was bound to respect. Black people were also now legally barred from filing suits at the federal level. What this did was limit the mobility of their cases, often making them lose. And on top of all of that, the ruling allowed the unhindered expansion of slavery into new states. As mentioned earlier, the Missouri Compromise divvied up new states equally between free states and slave states. It was repealed with the Kansas-Nebraska Act a few years before Dred Scott v. Sandford. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed all new states below the 40th parallel to vote whether their state should be a slave state or a free state. After the Dred Scott case, even that was repealed because Taney's Supreme Court permitted the unhindered expansion of slavery into all territories. Uncertainty about whether the entire West would become slave or free territories gripped the markets almost immediately. The East-West railroads collapsed almost immediately, which caused the downfall of large banks and the runs that ensued. What follows the runs has been called the Panic of 1857. This was a financial panic caused in part by a declining international economy and by the overexpansion of the domestic economy, and the Dred Scott case only added on top of that. In 1860, at the next election, the anti-slavery Republican Party, led by Lincoln, became a major political force, partly due to Northern voter opposition to the Supreme Court's decision in this case. The case also resulted in a step back on international diplomacy, as the United States was just setting itself on the world stage, but this case's result did not help. Dred Scott v. Sandford was one of the most consequential cases in U.S. history. But what happened to the Scott family? Irene Emerson transferred ownership of Scott and his family to their previous owner's son, Henry Taylor Blow. And due to backlash, Blow decided to free the Scott family. Dred Scott will forever be known as a leader who stood up for his rights and changed the United States forever.